Sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1883. Thomas wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he surveyed his struggling wheat fields. The drought had lasted 3 months now, and even his deep well was running dangerously low. At 45 years old, Thomas had seen plenty of hardships since arriving from Ireland 15 years earlier, but this season tested his resolve like never before. Small farmstead sat on the outskirts of a growing town of nearly 800 souls. The community had formed around the railroad depot, bringing hope and prosperity to this harsh desert landscape. Thomas had chosen his land carefully, near a natural spring that had sustained him through previous dry spells, but even that reliable water source had dwindled to barely a trickle. On this particular morning, Thomas walked the perimeter of his property, checking the irrigation ditches he had dug with his own hands. The channels lay empty, their wooden gates hanging uselessly open. He paused near the old oak tree that marked his eastern boundary, its massive trunk providing the only shade for miles around. Something caught his eye in the distance, a small figure moving slowly across the barren landscape. First, Thomas thought it might be a coyote or wild dog, but as the shape drew closer, he realized with alarm that it was a child. The small figure stumbled and fell, then struggled to stand again. Thomas dropped his tools and ran toward the approaching figure, his heart pounding with concern and caution. Relations between the white settlers and the Apache tribes had been tense for years, with occasional raids and conflicts keeping everyone on edge. As Thomas reached the child, he saw it was a young Apache boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. The child's dark eyes looked up at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. His small body was painfully thin, his ribs clearly visible through torn clothing. Dried blood caked a cut on his forehead, and his lips were cracked from dehydration. The boy tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged from his parched throat. Without hesitation, Thomas scooped the child into his arms. The boy weighed no more than a sack of grain, his body limp with exhaustion and starvation. Thomas felt the child's rapid, shallow breathing against his chest as he carried him toward the farmhouse. Every step seemed urgent. This young life was hanging by the thinnest of threads. "Mary," Thomas called out as he approached their modest wooden home. "Mary, come quickly." His wife appeared in the doorway, her kind face immediately showing concern when she saw the child in her husband's arms. Mary had always possessed a nurturing spirit that extended beyond their own family. Though they had lost their only daughter to fever 2 years earlier, her maternal instincts remained as strong as ever. "Dear Lord," Mary whispered, rushing to open the door wider. "Bring him inside, Thomas, quickly now." They laid the boy on their kitchen table, Mary immediately reaching for clean cloths and fresh water from their dwindling supply. She had learned basic medical care from the town doctor, knowledge that had served their community well over the years. As she gently cleaned the child's wounds, Thomas paced the small kitchen, his mind racing with questions and concerns. "He's Apache," Thomas said quietly, stating what they both already knew. "Been wandering for days by the look of him." Mary nodded, never pausing in her careful ministrations. "This child is someone's son," she replied firmly. "Whatever troubles there may be between our peoples, I won't let a child suffer when I can help." The boy's eyes fluttered open as Mary cleaned his face with cool water. He flinched at first, then seemed to realize these strangers meant him no harm. Thomas found himself looking into those dark eyes, seeing not the face of an enemy, but simply a frightened, hungry child far from home. "Can you tell us your name?" Mary asked gently, though she didn't expect the boy to understand English. Their surprise, the child whispered something that sounded like. He pointed weakly to his own chest, then closed his eyes again, too exhausted to maintain consciousness. Over the next several hours, Mary worked tirelessly to save the boy's life. She prepared thin broths from their precious supplies, coaxing small sips of liquid into him whenever he was conscious enough to swallow. Thomas fetched what little medicine they had, while Mary used her knowledge of herbs to create healing poultices for his wounds. By evening, Young showed signs of improvement. His breathing had steadied, and he was able to keep down small amounts of food. Mary had cleaned and bandaged his injuries, and the dangerous dehydration that had nearly claimed his life was slowly being reversed. As night fell, Thomas sat by the child's bedside, wrestling with difficult questions. How had this boy come to be alone in the desert? Where was his family? The Apache bands in the area were known to be protective of their children, never allowing them to wander far from the safety of their camps. Something terrible must have happened. Thomas knew that harboring an Apache child could bring danger to his family and possibly the entire town. Many of his neighbors viewed all Apache as threats to be eliminated rather than people to be understood. The territorial government had standing bounties on Apache raiders, and tensions frequently erupted into violence. Yet looking at this sleeping child, Thomas felt only compassion and a determination to do what was right. Mary joined him in their silent vigil, her hand resting gently on the boy's forehead to monitor his fever. "He's someone's precious child," she whispered. "Imagine if our little Sarah had been lost in the wilderness. Wouldn't we have prayed for a kind soul to help her?" Thomas nodded, his throat tight with emotion. The loss of their daughter still haunted both of them, creating a void that nothing could fill. Perhaps caring for this lost boy might bring some healing to their own wounded hearts. As dawn approached, opened his eyes and looked directly at Thomas. For the first time since his arrival, the child seemed truly alert and aware of his surroundings. He sat up slowly, wincing from his injuries but showing remarkable resilience for someone who had been near death just hours before. Boy looked around the unfamiliar room, taking in the simple furniture, the cross hanging on the wall, and the kind faces of his rescuers. When Mary approached with a cup of warm milk, he accepted it gratefully, drinking deeply before offering what Thomas recognized as Apache words of thanks. Thomas made a decision that would change not only their lives but the fate of their entire community. Rather than simply recovering the child and sending him away, he would care for until he was strong enough to safely return to his people. This choice, born from simple human decency, would set in motion a chain of events that none of them could have imagined. Farmer had fed a starving Apache child, and in doing so, he had planted the seeds of something far greater than he could have known. Over the following weeks, Young grew stronger under the careful care of Thomas and Mary. The boy proved to be remarkably intelligent and curious, picking up English words with surprising speed. Through a combination of gestures, simple drawings in the dirt, and his growing vocabulary, he began to communicate the tragic circumstances that had led him to their farm. Band had been attacked by a group of rogue soldiers who had deserted from the nearby fort. These men, driven by greed and hatred, had raided the peaceful Apache camp while most of the warriors were away hunting. In the chaos that followed, families had scattered in all directions, had become separated from his grandmother, who had been caring for him while his parents were away on a trading expedition to Mexico. Boy had wandered for 6 days through the unforgiving desert, living on cactus fruit and muddy water from rare desert springs. By the time he reached the farm, he was hours away from death. As Thomas listened to this story unfold over many evenings by their fireplace, he felt both rage at the injustice and deep sadness for all the child had endured. Meanwhile, word of the Apache boy's presence had begun to spread through. Thomas had hoped to keep his recovery quiet, but in a small frontier town, secrets were nearly impossible to maintain. When Mary visited the general store for supplies, sharp-eyed neighbors noticed she was purchasing more food than usual. When the town doctor made an unexpected visit to the farm, curious onlookers began asking questions. Reaction from the townspeople was mixed and often heated. Some, led by the saloon owner Jake, demanded that Thomas turn the boy over to the territorial authorities immediately. Had lost a brother in an Apache raid 3 years earlier and harbored deep resentment toward all Apache people. He argued loudly that harboring the child was tantamount to treason and would bring danger to their community. Others, particularly the women of the town, supported the compassionate decision. Sarah Collins, the schoolteacher, pointed out that the child posed no threat and deserved basic human decency. Dr. William Hayes, who had examined at Thomas's request, vouched for the boy's peaceful nature and genuine need for care. Tension reached a boiling point during a heated town meeting in the schoolhouse. Nearly the entire population had gathered to debate the fate of Young, and his supporters argued for immediate action, claiming that Apache scouts might already be tracking the boy and planning an attack on the town. Thomas stood before his neighbors, his voice steady despite the personal attacks being leveled against him. "This child was dying when I found him," he said firmly. "I won't apologize for saving a life regardless of his heritage. We are Christians here, and our faith teaches us to show mercy to those in need." Mary rose beside her husband, her quiet dignity commanding respect from even their harshest critics. "I've lost a child," she said softly, her words carrying weight because everyone in town knew of their tragedy. "I know the agony of a parent whose child is missing. Somewhere this boy's family is suffering that same pain. If we can reunite them safely, shouldn't that be our goal?" Debate continued late into the night, with no clear resolution. Some families threatened to leave if the Apache boy remained, while others promised to help protect him. The community found itself divided along lines that had never existed before, testing relationships and challenging long-held beliefs. As autumn approached, had not only recovered his health but had also become an integral part of the household. He helped Thomas with farm chores, showing an impressive understanding of agriculture and water management. The boy shared knowledge passed down through generations of Apache farmers, teaching Thomas more efficient ways to conserve precious water during the ongoing drought. Also formed a special bond with Mary, who began teaching him to read and write in English. In return, he shared stories of his people's traditions, their deep connection to the land, and their sophisticated understanding of desert survival. Mary found herself learning as much as she taught, gaining new perspectives on the world around them. One evening, as Thomas and worked together to repair a section of fence, the boy suddenly became very still and alert. His entire body tensed, and he stared intently toward the eastern hills. Thomas followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual in the gathering twilight. "What is it?" Thomas asked quietly. Held up his hand for silence, continuing to listen and watch with the intensity of a wild animal sensing danger. After several long minutes, he relaxed slightly and turned to Thomas with an expression that mixed excitement with apprehension. "My people," he said simply in English, "they come." Thomas felt his heart rate quicken. Over the past months, he had known this moment would eventually arrive, but he still felt unprepared for what it might bring. Would his family see thee as saviors or as kidnappers? Would they view the town as a threat to be eliminated? At night, Thomas barely slept. He stood watch from his porch, scanning the horizon for any sign of approaching Apache warriors. Seemed calm but alert, occasionally stepping outside to listen to sounds that Thomas couldn't detect. The boy's superior hearing and understanding of desert signs had been honed by a lifetime of living in harmony with this harsh environment. As dawn broke over the Arizona landscape, Thomas saw them. A small group of Apache riders appeared on the distant ridge, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun. Even from a distance, he could see they were well-armed and moving with the careful deliberation of experienced warriors. Ran to the porch and began making signals with his arms, communicating with his rescuers in a language of gestures that Thomas didn't understand. Lead rider separated from the group and approached the farm slowly, his hands visible to show peaceful intentions. As he drew closer, Thomas could see this was an older Apache man with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to leadership. Deep lines around his eyes spoke of wisdom, earned through years of hardship and survival. Called out in Apache, his voice filled with joy and relief. The approaching warrior's stern expression softened as he recognized the boy he had been searching for. When they were close enough to speak, the man dismounted and embraced with obvious affection. Translation, Thomas learned that this was Chief Running Bear, the boy's grandfather and leader of their small band. The chief had been searching for ever since the attack on their camp, following faint tracks and questioning other tribes about any sign of the missing child. Their journey had led them to the area around, where Apache scouts had observed the unusual activity at the farm. Chief Running Bear studied Thomas with intelligent, measuring eyes. He asked detailed questions about how the boy had been found, how he had been treated, and why the white farmer had chosen to help rather than turn him away. Thomas answered honestly, explaining his and Mary's motivations with simple directness. As their conversation continued, Mary emerged from the house carrying a large bundle of food and supplies she had prepared for his journey home. She approached the chief with respectful dignity, offering the provisions while expressing her hope that the boy would continue to grow strong and healthy. Chief Running Bear accepted the gifts with solemn gratitude, but Thomas sensed there was something more the Apache leader wanted to communicate. The chief spoke at length in his native language, his tone serious and ceremonial, listened intently, asking occasional questions before turning to translate. My grandfather says our people have a tradition, explained carefully. When someone saves the life of one of our family, especially a child, they create what we call a bond of protection. This means our families become connected, and we have obligations to help each other. Thomas wasn't entirely sure what this meant, but he nodded respectfully. Chief Running Bear continued speaking, his words carrying the weight of formal ceremony. He says you and your woman have shown great kindness to our family, translated. The debt can only be repaid by protecting those who showed mercy. My grandfather wants to know if you will accept this bond between our peoples. Thomas looked at Mary, seeing his own mixture of hope and uncertainty reflected in her eyes. They both understood that accepting this offer would fundamentally change their relationship with the Apache, but they also recognized the sincerity and honor behind the proposal. Tell your grandfather that we are honored by his offer, Thomas replied. We help because it was the right thing to do, not because we expected anything in return, but if this bond can help bring peace between our peoples, then we accept it gladly. Chief Running Bear nodded with satisfaction and spoke again. This time, his words carried an air of prophecy that made Thomas feel as though he was witnessing something of great historical significance. Apache leader mounted his horse and prepared to leave but before departing, he made one final statement that would prove to be both promise and warning. The bond of protection was now in place, and its power would be tested sooner than any of them could have imagined. Winter arrived early that year, bringing unusual cold and the first real relief from the devastating drought. Thomas found himself thinking often about Young and wondering how the boy was faring with his reunited family. The bond of protection that Chief Running Bear had spoken of seemed like a distant memory as daily life returned to its normal rhythms. However, the peace was shattered in February when urgent news reached the town. A large force of hostile Apache warriors, led by the notorious war chief, was moving through the territory, raiding settlements and attacking anyone who crossed their path. Unlike the peaceful band that belonged to, this group had refused all attempts at treaties and viewed all white settlers as enemies to be eliminated. The territorial governor had issued warnings to all frontier towns, advising them to prepare defenses or evacuate entirely. And his warriors had already destroyed 2 smaller settlements, leaving no survivors. Their reputation for brutality and tactical brilliance made them one of the most feared Apache groups in the entire Southwest. When this news reached, panic spread quickly through the community. The town had no military protection, being too small and remote to warrant a permanent garrison. Their only defenses were a handful of Civil War veterans and whatever weapons the settlers could gather. Against a force of experienced Apache warriors, their chances seemed hopeless. Jake, who had opposed helping months earlier, now led a faction demanding immediate evacuation. I told you all that helping that Apache boy would bring trouble, he shouted during another emergency town meeting. Now is coming for us, and we're all going to pay the price for foolishness. Thomas felt the weight of his neighbor's fear and anger, but he refused to accept responsibility for his actions. Has been raiding settlements long before ever came here, he replied firmly. This has nothing to do with the boy we helped. Dr. Hayes supported Thomas, pointing out that Swore Band operated completely independently from peaceful Apache groups. We can't blame every Apache for the actions of hostile warriors. he argued. That would be like holding every white person responsible for the crimes of outlaws and deserters. Despite the logical arguments, fear dominated the discussion. Families began loading wagons and preparing to abandon their homes for the safety of larger towns further east. The exodus had already begun when riders appeared on the horizon, causing panic among those still preparing to leave. These weren't warriors. Thomas recognized the distinctive riding style and horse markings of Chief Running Bear's band. As the Apache riders approached under a white flag of truce, many townspeople fled to their homes and barricaded their doors. Only Thomas, Mary, Dr. Hayes, and a few others remained in the street to greet the visitors. Chief Running Bear rode at the head of a group of 20 warriors, all painted and armed for battle. Behind him, Thomas was surprised and delighted to see, now looking taller and stronger than when they had parted months earlier. The boy's face lit up with joy when he saw but the serious nature of the visit kept him from breaking protocol. Translation, Chief Running Bear explained that his scouts had been tracking his war band for weeks. The hostile chief was indeed heading toward, planning to attack the settlement in 3 days' time. Commanded nearly 60 experienced warriors, far too many for the peaceful Apache band to confront directly. "Why are you telling us this?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Chief Running Bear's response, translated carefully by, confirmed Thomas's hopes and fears. "My grandfather says the bond of protection requires our people to warn those who showed kindness to our family, but he also says is too strong for our warriors to fight alone." The Apache chief then outlined a desperate plan that could save the town, but would require tremendous trust from both sides. Rather than face certain defeat against superior force, the people would need to trust their former enemies to protect them. Chief Running Bear proposed that the townspeople evacuate to a hidden canyon known to his people, where natural defenses would make it nearly impossible to attack effectively. Meanwhile, the peaceful Apache would set an ambush for the hostile war band, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to even the odds. The plan required perfect timing and complete cooperation between two groups who had viewed each other with suspicion for years. If it failed, both the town and the peaceful Apache band would be destroyed. If it succeeded, it would create a new understanding between the communities that could last for generations. Thomas found himself in the position of convincing his terrified neighbors to trust their lives to the very people, many of them still considered enemies. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same townspeople who had opposed helping were now being asked to accept help from the boy's family. The debate that followed tested every relationship and belief in. Some families refused to consider the plan and departed immediately for distant towns. Others, particularly those who had supported the decision to help, recognized the wisdom and necessity of accepting Apache protection. Sarah Collins, the schoolteacher, proved to be an unexpected ally in convincing others. "These Apache are offering to risk their lives to save ours," she argued. "If they wanted to harm us, they could have simply said nothing about and let him attack without warning." Dr. Hayes added his medical perspective, pointing out that the hidden canyon Chief Running Bear described would provide better protection than anything they could create in town. "Sometimes survival requires trusting people we don't fully understand," he said quietly. After hours of heated discussion, the town reached a reluctant consensus. Those who chose to stay would follow Chief Running Bear's plan, while others would continue their evacuation to more distant settlements. About half the population decided to trust the Apache protection, including the Dr. Hayes, Sarah Collins, and surprisingly, even some of his followers. Next 2 days passed in careful preparation. Chief Running Bear's warriors helped the townspeople move essential supplies to the hidden canyon, a remarkable natural fortress surrounded by steep cliffs and accessible only through a narrow entrance that could be easily defended. The Apache showed the settlers how to conceal their presence and prepare for a potentially long siege. Meanwhile, other Apache warriors prepared the ambush that would determine everyone's fate. They studied its approach route, identified the best positions for attack, and coordinated their strategy with the precision of a military campaign. Chief Running Bear had fought against overwhelming odds before and understood that their only chance lay in superior tactics and intimate knowledge of the land. Served as a messenger between the two groups, his bilingual abilities proving invaluable in coordinating the complex plan. Thomas watched the boy with pride, seeing how the months of recovery and the kindness he had received had given him confidence and strength. The starving child they had found wandering the desert had grown into a capable young man who could bridge two worlds. On the morning of the third day, and his war band appeared on the eastern ridge overlooking. The hostile chief expected to find a defenseless town ripe for plunder, but instead discovered what appeared to be a completely abandoned settlement. His warriors spread out to search the empty buildings while himself rode into the town square, his suspicion growing with each deserted house. The trap was sprung with devastating precision. Chief Running Bear's warriors had positioned themselves in carefully chosen locations throughout the town, using the buildings and terrain to maximum advantage. Once band was fully committed to the search, the peaceful Apache struck from multiple directions simultaneously. Battle was fierce but brief. Warriors, despite their reputation and numbers, found themselves caught in a masterfully executed ambush with no clear escape routes. The hostile chief himself fell early in the fighting, struck down by one of Chief Running Bear's most experienced warriors. Without their charismatic leader, the remaining raiders quickly scattered in all directions. Their threat to the region permanently ended. When the Apache scouts signaled that the danger had passed, the hidden townspeople emerged from their canyon refuge to find their settlement intact and their protectors victorious. The cost of the battle had been high for Chief Running Bear's band. Several warriors had been wounded, and one young brave had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect the people of. The aftermath of the battle created a transformation that none of them could have anticipated. The successful cooperation between the Apache and the townspeople had proven that their two communities could work together as allies rather than enemies. Trust, once established through shared danger, began to grow into genuine friendship and mutual respect. Thomas stood in the town square, surveying the evidence of the battle that had saved their community. Beside him, translated as Chief Running Bear spoke about the future relationship between their peoples. The bond of protection that had begun with one farmer's decision to feed a starving child had now grown into something that would benefit both communities for years to come. Trade agreements were established, allowing the Apache access to tools and supplies they needed while giving the townspeople knowledge of survival techniques and desert agriculture. The schoolteacher, Sarah Collins, began teaching Apache children alongside the town's youth, while Apache elders shared their wisdom about living in harmony with the harsh desert environment. Most importantly, the threat of violence that had hung over both communities for so long was replaced by a partnership based on mutual respect and shared benefit. It became known throughout the territory as a place where Apache and white settlers lived and worked together peacefully, serving as an example of what was possible when fear was replaced by understanding. Years later, as Thomas sat on his porch watching Help teach his own children about farming and survival, he often reflected on the simple decision that had changed everything. The act of feeding one starving child had saved an entire town and created a legacy of cooperation that would last for generations. Farmer had shown mercy to a dying Apache boy, and in return, that boy's people had protected the farmer's entire community. It was a story that would be told and retold, passed down through families on both sides, serving as a reminder that kindness and courage could triumph over hatred and fear. In a land often divided by violence and mistrust, the bond forged between Thomas and Chief Running Bear's people proved that different communities could find common ground and build a better future together.